So in today's office hours video, I want to talk about interest. And specifically, I want to break apart interest and talk about how it's a more complicated, maybe more multifaceted thing than most people probably think on the surface. I also want to get at this idea that maybe interest is necessary for learning or a signal that learning is happening. And before I get into it, I want to make it very clear that I, of course, think interest is important and valuable and that it is worthwhile to make engaging classrooms and that we do want our students to be interested in things. However, there are some differences when we look at different types of interests, and I want to kind of break that apart more because it's not necessarily the case that you have to be interested in order to learn something, right? That you can learn something that is very boring. We've all had to learn boring things. However, again, it is definitely worthwhile to make sure something is interesting and engaging. So what do I mean by interest being this multifaceted thing? We can kind of think of these two different extremes. On the one hand, you have what we call situational interest. And this is interest that is generated by the situation, as it sounds. So think of a flashy classroom demonstration or a really funny joke that illustrates a point, right? That gets students' attention, it is interesting, and it's that situation itself that is interesting. And that interest is kind of separate from or in addition to the actual content. On the other hand, we have what we call maybe a well-developed interest or an individual interest. So I am interested in psychology and learning and memory, and not only am I interested in that, I spend a lot of time studying it because I think it's interesting. So there, my interest is really a signal that, one, I will pay more attention to these things, but two, probably more importantly, I have this really well-developed background knowledge that I'm bringing to the situation. So we might call both things interest, and you might ask somebody, was that interesting? Were you interested in today's class? And they might say yes in both scenarios, but you don't know if that interest is being generated because of just some sort of situational thing, or again, if their interest is a signal of maybe some deeper understanding and some background knowledge. Obviously, in the case of the well-developed individual interest, that background understanding is going to help the learning a lot more because they have this prior knowledge and maybe even a bit of expertise in the topic. They might be more likely to learn something in that class just because they have a better framework for understanding than maybe students who don't have that previous experience. It's also pretty likely that these students will be more likely to re-engage with the material, look stuff up on their own, complete their homework, ask questions, right? All these other things that we might see as signs of engagement. So it's kind of difficult to tease apart what the two things are. And a model that I like to use that I think is really useful is the 4-phase model of interest development by Heedy and Rennaker in 2006. They wrote a paper on this. And I think it's a nice framework for maybe understanding how we can move from a situational interest all the way over to a well-developed interest. Again, both are interesting, but one of these things is a signal that that good learning is going on. The other thing might just be situational and might be kind of fleeting. So in this model, you have a triggered situational interest, right? There was a really cool show that somebody watched, a really fun in-class demonstration. There was a funny joke that happened, right? All those kinds of things that might trigger somebody's interest. Maybe the teacher does a really good job of relating it back to the student. And we've talked about things being personally relatable before, and that does really help with memory. So that maybe we gave you a really good, relevant, topical example of some phenomenon that we're studying, and that made it interesting. So that's nice, but that situational interest does not necessarily lead to long-term interest. That's not necessarily going to persist, but it can be a starting point. So in this 4-phase model, they talk about how you might go from situational interest to maintained situational interest. Okay, so now I've caught your attention with this relevant and timely example of something. We're going to keep coming back to it and maybe updating that as we go on to kind of maintain your interest. An example that happens, at least at the college level every 4 years is we see an increase in the number of political science majors. So as elections are happening and people are much more engaged in that kind of discussion, we see students being more engaged in those classes because it's topical, it's very relevant for them. So that's kind of a sustained situational interest. Then we get into a sort of moderate individual interest, right? So at some point, this goes from this sort of topical, relevant thing to, no, it turns out I've been doing some background reading to this. I've been talking about this thing a lot, and I kind of have a good idea, a really good, a general knowledge base of this concept of this topic. And then we move from that to the well-developed individual interest. And so here it's really kind of difficult to separate out interest and expertise. Right? So when we ask whether or not we are making something interesting in the classroom, it's important to recognize that there is a difference between, again, this well-developed individual interest, which might be a signal that there's this other background stuff happening, and the situational interest that can be kind of fleeting. So as teachers, right, we have to kind of decide how we're going to get there. There are a lot of factors that influence whether or not someone will develop this well-developed individual interest. There are a lot of steps along the way from your first encounter with something that may or may not have been interesting. Then we have sustained interest, then we have a somewhat developed interest, and then we have a well-developed interest, right? This stuff doesn't happen over the course of a day or a few weeks or even a few months, really, right? To go from a situational interest all the way over to a well-developed interest, that's something that's more in the order of years. So if one of your goals is to develop interest in your topic area, it's useful to keep in mind that you aren't going to get there overnight. You can certainly help set the stage, provide opportunities for students to re-engage with the material, and there are all these other effective learning practices that come when you have well-developed interests. Re-engagement with the material means you're probably going to be practicing retrieval, maybe not formally, but just because you're talking with your friends about it or saying, oh, I read this thing, right? You have to recall that and bring that to mind, and that's going to be beneficial. That's also going to be doing spaced retrieval, interleaving, right? So we get all these other beneficial learning things that happen when we have this well-developed interest that kind of like feeds off of itself. On the other hand, the situational interest, if you're trying to improve interest by kind of just offering up these fun examples, flashy demonstrations, you might get some situational interest, but it may not be translating to long-term learning that you might be looking for. Not that they're bad. I certainly see value in making a funny joke when it's relevant and appropriate, giving timely examples, having cool demonstrations in class, right? All of those are definitely necessary to kind of set the stage for this future learning. But I think it's important to recognize that that in of itself does not equal future learning, right? It can maybe kickstart a process that's going to take place over time, but it's not going to guarantee that now students will suddenly be very interested and very knowledgeable in this thing. So again, there are lots of things that affect this. When we look at the literature, yes, there are things that you can do in classrooms, doing project-based learning, providing multiple opportunities for people to engage with the material. Again, a lot of that lines up with some of the effective learning strategies that we've talked about in terms of, really all of them could be employed there. Retrieval practice, spaced learning, interleaving, giving concrete examples, elaborating, right? All of those things can be things that are helping students re-engage with material and help them develop their interests. So there's certainly things that you can do in the classroom to help students develop their interests, but there are a lot of things that we just don't have control over. Studies of interest have shown that there seems to be some minor genetic component to interest, especially when we look at, weirdly, there's been a lot of career studies on, what do people choose as a vocational interest. There's obviously stuff that goes on at home that we have no idea about, no control over, as well as things like just general classroom dynamics. When people are developing interests, it helps if they have other students who have similar interests, so they can share that and again have the opportunity to re-engage with the material. So I wanted to bring this up because I know that I have conversations with some of the other faculty at my school when they ask about how can they improve engagement in the classroom and how can they improve interest. And I always try to tease apart and say, well, what do we mean by interest and what do we mean by engagement? Do you want them to be engaged as in they're asking questions, they're demonstrating understanding, they are having to use their own knowledge in creative ways, right? That's maybe one set of practices. And when you say interest, do you mean, gosh, I just wish they would stay awake in class, right? Like that would be a good starting point. So there's a lot of these different components. So I just want to take a few minutes today to talk about the differences between these different levels of interest, to recognize that it's a process, that we can go from a situational to a well-developed interest, and to kind of reinforce the role of instructors and teachers in, I would say, setting the stage for interest and providing opportunities for re-engagement and how that's going to be beneficial for learning.